We will analyze the Mercedes by Anna Kavan from 1970, and Tilly will start out with the narrative technique.
The narrator in the short story is a first-person narrator, and we read the story from her point of view, which means we only have access to her thoughts and feelings, which can be seen in this quote. So I was worried about getting one for him on the first page in line 5. When the reader does not know the other character's thoughts, will it somehow become more difficult to get the complete understanding of the text because some pieces of information might be missing and the reader has to interpret the story? It is not clear how trustworthy our main character is. A lot of feelings are involved, especially in the last section, and therefore it is not always clear how trustworthy the narrator is when describing other characters in the scene.
We also have done a characterization of the characters, and we would like to characterize the main character and M. The main character can be difficult to characterize, and we only have access to a limited amount of information about the main character, which makes him or her a flat character. We do not know which gender the main character is, but we know that he or she also attends the story as the narrator in the short story. We do know that the character M comes to visit the narrator once in a while, but it's not clear how the relationship works or from where they know each other. But we do know that M's wife knows where her husband is, that he is staying with the narrator, and it indicates that they might have a special relationship, as we see it in this quote on page 1. And it was his wife sounding annoyed and worried because the patient had rung up to say M hadn't arrived, and she guessed he was with me. The wife knows that they have a special bond, but we do not know if the relationship is built on romantic feelings.
Inner characterization. The narrator's inner character trait says something about how he or she feels for M. The narrator mentions that if M someday gets to buy his own Mercedes, they would drive away together. This idea is very romanticized in the narrator's head, and when he drives off without him or her, in the end, the narrator becomes very frustrated and confused. The narrator knows he will not come back because you can return to life after death. I knew there was no hope of ever seeing him again. Hadn't we always said we would never come back? That was a quote. The narrator cares a lot about M, and it's shown through the description of M and of her own actions, where she helps him with the taxi and worries about him.
The character M is a doctor, and we know that he is ill. He visits the narrator, as we said, on the way to one of his patients, and the first person narrator also tells us on page 2 that he's such a brilliant doctor and very good with his patients. He, although can't afford a car and wishes to earn enough money to someday buy a Mercedes. The Mercedes is a symbol of a better life, and it's very important information because it doesn't make a lot of sense that a doctor can't afford to buy a car with their kind of salary. As we know, he's ill and he dies in the end of the story, but he's also described as gay right before he dies, and it might be a reference to his acceptance of his death, because he knows that it is the next step in life. M is kind of mysterious, and when he's with the main character in the beginning, he jumps up and rushes to the door to see the patients with no warning, as we see in this quote. Then the clock had struck, and he has suddenly jumped up and said he must go at once, as if the patient couldn't survive another half hour without him. The quote illustrates his mysterious traits, and one of his phrases is also, "It can't be helped." The narrator tells us that she or he also thought of this phrase as a phrase where all his disappointments and disasters from his early life before he was living in exile. But it is though repeated in the last part of the story, and this time it is about death and how death can be helped, which characterizes him as a person with acceptance when it comes to death, also because he is ill.
Yes, and as Katinka mentioned, the Mercedes is a strong symbol of the short story. Throughout the text, we have the Mercedes in the start, and later on, it's a symbol of status, a better life, wealth, and then in the end, also his life in the afterlife. It's the symbol of how his life has gone from good when he had a Mercedes, and then to bad when he didn't have it, and then again when he gets it, he finds peace when it arrives and takes him away to the heaven. Also the ebony of the new Mercedes, which comes and pick him up, symbolizes purity, power, and balance. This can be seen in relation to M's situation, where he finally finds balance again after as mentioned in the quote on page 2, line 6, he'd come to live in exile in this country after losing everything in his own, and had a terrible time one way and another. So he now finds peace again. Another symbol of the story is the storm, which symbolizes how up until the moment where the new Mercedes arrives, we see a storm, or we get to know in the story that there is a storm happening, and this ends right at the same moment as the car arrives, and therefore symbolizes how M finds peace. And the quote is, "The storm ended abruptly. Quite suddenly the wind dropped," and then we see how M is joyful again, and from the narrator's perspective, he looks younger, he looks better. Throughout the text, there's also some language which is quite special. For example, there is an oxymoron with silence was listening. Yes.
Yes. The settings in this short story is very physical. The physical settings also only is at the narrator's home and at his district, which we see first time on the first line, where he says, "Some recent taxis are always scarred in my district." Also, we know that it's night and it's in the winter, because on page 1 we hear that the patient he went to the door for his overcoat, and also on page 2, line 17, when he says, "Take him to them in the ghastly winter." Also, we hear that that M's wife calls that M shouldn't be out at night. Also, in fact, on page 1, line 14, we hear, "In fact, on such a filthy night, he shouldn't be out at all." Yes, then it's time for the theme.
Yes, we have found that the theme of the story is life and death, because we touch this topic throughout the whole text, and it's really at the last part of the story. It has a large meaning. We see him drive off, so it could also be seen. Another theme and topic of the story could be letting go, because the narrator has to let go of M. They were meant to drive off together, she thought, which could be seen as a family of two lovers that wanted to drive off together, that wanted to live life together, that wanted to come to the afterlife together, but doesn't. Yes, he says it can't be helped, for instance. Yes. Yeah, that's just how life is. That some move on for others. Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Get it, DJ.
Cut it, DJ.